The elegant ballroom of the White House was abuzz with the quiet hum of murmured conversations. Guests, adorned in their finest attire, sipped champagne as they admired the exquisite arrangements set for the evening's grand state dinner. The air was crisp with anticipation. This wasn't just any dinner, it was the kind of event where the world's most influential leaders gathered and where every detail was meticulously planned. At the center of the kitchen, standing tall and commanding, was Chef Samuel Carter. Known for his precision, his ability to create culinary masterpieces, and his unwavering dedication to his craft, Chef Carter was the heartbeat of the evening. He had earned his place at the table of American cuisine, revered by the elite for his innovative approach to traditional dishes. But tonight, this dinner, hosted by President Donald Trump, would test his resolve like never before. It was a highly anticipated event with foreign dignitaries, political allies, and corporate giants in attendance. The menu had been curated to perfection, each dish representing the best of American flavors with a touch of international flair. But as Chef Carter checked the plates of hors d'oeuvres for the last time before they were sent out, he had no idea that a simple request would soon change the course of the evening and perhaps his career. "Chef Carter," a voice boomed from behind him. He turned to see one of the White House staff members, a flustered look on their face. "The president would like a word with you, privately. He's in the dining room." Chef Carter straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. There was no mistaking the seriousness of the request. He had met President Trump several times before, brief exchanges in the Oval Office or during private briefings about the dinner. But this was different. The president wanted to speak with him during the dinner, at the height of the event. Something felt off. "Of course," Chef Carter replied, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in his chest. As he walked toward the dining room, Chef Carter couldn't help but feel the weight of the evening pressing down on him. This was his moment, his opportunity to show the world that his food could rival any high-profile chef in the country. He passed the long tables, draped in fine linens, with the glint of crystal glasses catching the light, before finally entering the room where President Trump was seated at the head of the table. The president, flanked by his closest advisors, looked up with a wide smile as Chef Carter approached. "Chef, excellent work tonight." "The food is fantastic," Trump said, his tone warm but authoritative. "However, I've got a little issue I need your help with." Chef Carter raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Of course, Mr. President. What seems to be the problem?" Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting slightly as he gestured to the staff member standing beside him. "You see, I have a bit of a request. We're all about luxury here, Chef. I'm sure you understand that. The guests are here for more than just a great meal, they're here for an experience. So, I was thinking about something a little special. Something a bit more extravagant. Perhaps a change in the menu for the next course." Chef Carter's stomach tightened. It wasn't uncommon for changes to be requested last minute, but this felt different. There was a pressure in the air, as though the president's request wasn't just a suggestion, it was an order. "What do you have in mind, Mr. President?" Chef Carter asked, keeping his voice even, though he could feel the gears in his mind already turning. "Well, Chef, you know how we love to make a statement here in this country. I want to see something bold, something extravagant. I was thinking a dish of Wagyu beef, topped with gold flakes. No, wait, I'm gonna go bigger. A lobster tail, but make it the biggest lobster tail anyone's ever seen. I want to show them who's really in charge here." Chef Carter blinked, trying to process what had just been said. Wagyu beef and gold flakes? That was one thing. But a giant lobster tail? Was this what the evening had come to? "I'm afraid we can't do that, Mr. President," Chef Carter replied, his voice calm but firm. "Not only is it out of line with the menu we've prepared, but it also goes against the principles of what this dinner stands for. We're here to showcase the best of American cuisine, in a way that reflects the diversity and quality of our food culture. Going over the top with something like that would detract from that vision." There was a moment of stunned silence. President Trump's eyes narrowed slightly. His gaze was no longer warm but calculating. "Are you telling me what I can and can't do with my dinner, Chef?" Chef Carter stood his ground. He could feel the eyes of the staff and the few guests in the periphery of the room watching intently. But he knew in that moment that if he backed down, he would lose his integrity and possibly his job. "What I'm saying, Mr. President, is that I won't compromise the integrity of this meal for spectacle. It's important that we honor the people who are here, not simply show off." President Trump's face hardened, his jaw tightening. The air in the room seemed to grow colder. "You do realize who I am, don't you, Chef?" "I do," Chef Carter said, nodding respectfully. And I also realize what this dinner represents. It's about more than just feeding people. It's about sharing something meaningful. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The silence hung between them like a heavy cloud, thick and unyielding. President Trump's gaze never left Chef Carter's face. For a moment, the kitchen, the dinner guests, and even the whole grandeur of the event seemed to fade into the background. The only thing that mattered now was the showdown between the chef and the President of the United States. For Chef Carter, this wasn't just about a dinner. It wasn't about politics, or even about the guests seated in the next room. It was about his integrity as a chef, his commitment to the food he served, and the values that had carried him to the top of his profession. To him, food was more than just an item on a plate. It was an art form, a reflection of culture and respect for those who enjoyed it. "You're being stubborn, chef," Trump finally said, breaking the silence with a sharp tone. "This is a state dinner. It's a chance to make an impact, to show the world who we are." "Do you want me to tell the world that the White House couldn't deliver on luxury? I can't afford to look weak. I need this dinner to be a spectacle. You understand that, right?" Chef Carter stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture unwavering. "I understand, Mr. President, but I'm afraid luxury doesn't come at the expense of authenticity. You asked for a meal that represents the best of America, and that's what I've delivered. Changing the menu now would undermine that message. It would be a distraction from what's truly important." Trump leaned forward in his chair, his fingers steepled together as if calculating his next move. "You're a good chef, Carter. I've heard good things about you. But this is different. This is about more than just food. This is about power, influence, and showing the world that the U.S. leads in all things, including our dining experiences. I need you to understand that." Chef Carter felt his heart rate quicken, but his mind remained clear. He had worked for years to earn his reputation, not by kowtowing to requests for extravagant displays, but by creating dishes that told a story. A story of America's farmers, its workers, its cultures, and its diverse traditions. This wasn't the moment to compromise on his values. He had stood in kitchens across the world, from Michelin-starred restaurants in Europe to humble farm-to-table spots in the U.S., and never once had he been asked to sacrifice the integrity of his craft for spectacle. Now it seemed his greatest test was here. "I hear what you're saying, Mr. President," Chef Carter replied, his voice calm but firm. "But I won't change the menu. If that's a problem, then perhaps this dinner isn't the right venue for that kind of display. We can find another way to impress your guests without compromising the experience." Trump's face darkened as his jaw clenched. "You're refusing to follow a direct order. You're refusing me." His voice rose and the tension in the room became palpable. The staff, who had been watching the exchange from the edges of the room, exchanged nervous glances. No one spoke, but the weight of the moment was clear. This was no longer a simple discussion about food, this was about authority, power, and control. Chef Carter stood his ground, knowing full well the consequences of his words. "I'm not refusing you, Mr. President. I'm simply standing by what I believe is right. I am the chef here. I've earned my place at this table because of my dedication to the craft, not because I'm willing to compromise on the principles I've built my career on." There was a long pause as Trump studied him, his face an unreadable mask. The president's fingers drummed softly on the edge of the table as if he was weighing his options. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You have a lot of nerve, Carter, but I can respect that. You stand by your principles, and I respect a man who can do that." He leaned back in his chair, a slight smile curling on his lips. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But don't mistake this for a victory. I'll let this one go, but understand this, Chef, not everyone gets to walk away from me like this." The words stung, but Chef Carter refused to flinch. "I don't want to walk away from anything, Mr. President. I just want to make sure this dinner is remembered for the right reasons." Trump stared at him for a few more seconds, the heat of the moment slowly beginning to fade. The president's expression softened just a little. "All right, Chef. You've made your point. Let's stick with what you've planned. But I want you to know that this is the kind of thing that'll make or break you." With that, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate, though Chef Carter knew the president's words carried weight. He had stood up to the most powerful man in the world, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if that would be the end of his career. But something inside him told him he had done the right thing. As Chef Carter turned to leave the room, Trump called after him, his voice surprisingly more relaxed. "Carter, you're one hell of a chef. Just remember, if you want to survive in this world, you'll need more than just talent. You'll need to know when to bend. And when to stand tall." Chef Carter paused at the door and turned to face the president one last time. I'll keep that in mind, Mr. President. But some things like my integrity are non-negotiable. Trump's lips curled into a smile, and for the first time that evening, the tension seemed to lift entirely. Fair enough, Chef. Fair enough. The next few minutes passed in a blur for Chef Carter. His heart was still racing from the tension in the room, but as he made his way back to the kitchen, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Despite the president's threats, despite the pressure to conform, he had stood his ground. He had done something few chefs or anyone in the room would dare to do. He had defied the President of the United States, and he had won. The kitchen, usually a chaotic place, felt unusually still as Chef Carter entered. The staff immediately turned to face him, their faces a mix of anticipation and concern. Everyone had heard the commotion that had emanated from the dining room, and the air was thick with the question of what had just transpired. What happened? One of the sous chefs asked, her voice hushed as if afraid to speak too loudly. Chef Carter took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It's over. We stick to the menu, he said, his voice calm but with a hint of exhaustion. The president wasn't happy, but he understood. We're moving forward with what we've planned. There was a collective sigh of relief among the staff, but there was also a sense of awe. They had all watched the events unfold from a distance, and most of them had never seen anyone challenge Trump like that, especially not in the middle of a high-profile state dinner. Chef Carter's head chef, Marcus, stepped forward, a knowing look in his eyes. You did good, Chef. That was a tough call, but you stood your ground. I think you just earned a lot of respect in this kitchen. Chef Carter nodded, but his mind was already moving on to the next challenge. The dinner was far from over. He still had to oversee the rest of the courses, ensure everything went off without a hitch, and keep his composure in the face of a room full of powerful and judgmental people. But now there was an added layer of pressure. He couldn't help but wonder if the president's reaction would cause any fallout. Would there be consequences for his refusal? The evening wore on, and as the courses flowed from the kitchen to the dining room, Chef Carter focused on the food. The perfectly roasted lamb, the delicate lobster bisque, the vibrant salads, all of it had been prepared with the same precision and care that had earned him his place in this prestigious kitchen. He had no time to dwell on the political drama. The food had to be perfect. As the final course was being plated, Chef Carter found himself standing at the back of the kitchen, surveying the room. The staff was busy putting finishing touches on the dessert course, an elegant chocolate mousse with a touch of orange zest, and Chef Carter allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Despite the drama, despite the confrontation, he had made it through. The meal was a success, and the guests seemed to be enjoying it. But just as he was about to call for the dessert course to be served, the door to the kitchen swung open, and a familiar figure appeared, President Trump. For a moment, Chef Carter's heart skipped a beat. What was the president doing back here? Had he come to reprimand him again? The staff looked up nervously, unsure of how to react, but Chef Carter remained calm. I just wanted to thank you, Chef, Trump said, his tone much lighter than before. I have to admit I was a bit upset earlier, but you've done something impressive tonight. You stuck to your guns, and the dinner? Well, it was damn good. Better than expected, honestly. A real treat. Chef Carter was taken aback. After everything that had happened, after the tension in the dining room, he hadn't expected this level of praise. The president, who had been so adamant earlier about the extravagant changes, was now offering a genuine compliment. Thank you, Mr. President, Chef Carter replied, his voice steady but with a touch of surprise. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Trump took a step closer, lowering his voice. You know, Carter, I think you might have just made a friend in me. I respect a man who knows what he stands for. And tonight, you showed me that. But remember, this world is all about appearances. And if you want to survive, you'll need to keep your eyes on more than just the food. Chef Carter nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Politics and power went hand in hand, and in this world, nothing was ever as straightforward as it seemed. Still, he had stood up for what he believed in, and somehow that had earned him Trump's respect. Thank you, Mr. President, Chef Carter said again, his voice calm and composed. I'll keep that in mind. Trump gave a small smile, then turned and walked back toward the dining room. Chef Carter watched him go, a sense of relief washing over him. The night was far from over, but for the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe again. As the final course was served and the dinner came to a close, Chef Carter couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. He had faced an unprecedented challenge, standing up to the president in the very heart of the White House, and had somehow come out on top. But he knew this victory wasn't just about the meal or the praise he had received. It was about something deeper. Chef Carter had proven to himself and to everyone else in that room that integrity mattered. That food was more than just a tool for power or a symbol of wealth. It was an expression of culture, of respect, and of values. And no matter how high the stakes, those things could never be compromised. The night was winding down, but the air in the kitchen was still electric. The staff continued to buzz with a nervous energy, the event finally coming to an end. Plates were cleared, glasses were refilled, and the sounds of clinking silverware and low murmurs from the dining room faded into the background. But Chef Carter's mind remained focused, his thoughts circling back to the events that had just transpired. What had just happened? He had defied the President of the United States, and somehow that decision had led to one of the most successful meals of his career. Yet, as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, the reality set in. What would be the fallout from such a bold act? He knew better than anyone that moments like these, when power, politics, and food collide, had the potential to create ripples far beyond the walls of the White House. The press would have a field day. There would be rumors, whispers, and opinions on every side. The question lingered. How would the president's allies view what had happened? Would Chef Carter's career be the price for his defiance? As Chef Carter stood in the kitchen quietly surveying the cleanup, his assistant, Lila, approached him. Her eyes were wide with concern, but also with an admiration that had become clear to everyone present after the president's visit to the kitchen. Chef, Lila began cautiously, you really did it. You stood up to him. I'm impressed. But, do you think that might come back to bite us? The president doesn't exactly take kindly to people challenging him. Chef Carter turned to face her, a faint smile playing on his lips. I know, Lila. But sometimes standing by your principles is worth the risk. This meal wasn't about Trump. It was about showcasing what this country stands for: honesty, authenticity, and respect for tradition. You can't compromise that just to please a few people. Lila nodded slowly, processing his words. You're right. But what if this doesn't go the way you think it will? What if it becomes a bigger issue? The worry was understandable. The kitchen had been filled with tension during the entire evening, and no one could predict how the political world would react to Chef Carter's refusal. Still, Chef Carter wasn't going to second-guess himself now. He had made his decision, and he wasn't about to backpedal. The dinner had gone well, the guests had been satisfied, and even the president, for all his tough talk, had ultimately acknowledged the quality of the food. Whatever happens, Lila, we've done our job, he said with conviction. We've created something real. And that's the most important thing. We'll face whatever comes next together as a team. Lila gave him a small smile, clearly comforted by his words. I guess you're right. You've always taught us that cooking is about more than just the food, it's about standing by what you believe in. I've learned that from you tonight. Just as Chef Carter was about to respond, the kitchen door swung open once again, and to his surprise, it wasn't the staff or another member of the administration. Instead, it was a familiar figure, Sarah, the White House press secretary. Chef Carter, she began, her voice formal but not unfriendly, can I have a word? Chef Carter raised an eyebrow, unsure of what this was about. Of course, Sarah. What can I do for you? She stepped into the kitchen, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. I just wanted to let you know that the president, well, he's talking about your refusal in a very different light now. He's telling people you stood your ground, and he respects that. Chef Carter's eyebrows furrowed slightly in surprise. He's talking about it? Sarah nodded, giving him a small, knowing smile. In his own way, yeah. He didn't like the refusal, but he respects you for not folding under pressure. It's not something you see every day, especially in this town. He's telling everyone you're a man of principle. It took Chef Carter a moment to process what she was saying. He had expected the worst, a reprimand, a backlash, maybe even his removal from the prestigious event, but what Sarah was telling him was something entirely different. I'm surprised, Chef Carter said, still processing the news. I thought he would be angry, that it would be a big problem. After everything that happened in there. Trust me, Sarah cut in, he was mad. He's not a fan of being challenged, especially not in public. But there's something about you, something about your authenticity that he can't ignore. He likes people who have the courage to stand up for themselves, even if it's not exactly what he wanted. Chef Carter thought about her words for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. This was a situation that could have easily gone south, but somehow it had turned into a kind of victory. It was a strange, unexpected victory, but a victory nonetheless. What happens next? Chef Carter asked, still unsure of what this meant for him in the long run. You'll be fine, Sarah assured him. The president is no stranger to controversy, and if anything, your defiance is making people talk. It might even play to your advantage. People like a good story, especially one where someone stands up to authority and wins. Chef Carter couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. In that moment, it felt as though the weight he had been carrying for the past few hours was finally beginning to lift. He had faced the president, stood up for what he believed in, and had come out on the other side stronger, if not unscathed. "I'll keep that in mind," he said with a nod. "Thank you, Sarah, for letting me know." She smiled before turning to leave. "Just keep doing what you do best, Chef. That's all you can control. And don't be afraid to stand up for yourself again if it comes to that. You've earned that right." As Sarah exited the kitchen, Chef Carter allowed himself a moment of peace. The storm had passed. For now at least. The days following the state dinner were a whirlwind of activity. But for Chef Carter, they were also a time of reflection. The media buzzed with reports about the tense moments during the dinner, the president's sudden visit to the kitchen, and, of course, the chef's refusal to comply with Trump's demand. For some, it was a controversy, a spectacle, something to be analyzed, debated, and discussed at length. For others, it was a symbol of defiance and integrity, of someone standing up for their values no matter the cost. Chef Carter stayed out of the limelight as much as possible. He was grateful for the respect he had earned within the kitchen and from the staff, but he had never been one to seek attention or headlines. His passion had always been about the food, about creating something special, and about ensuring his team could thrive. But as the calls and messages poured in, he realized that this moment wasn't just about food. It was about something bigger. One afternoon, as Chef Carter walked into the kitchen, he was met with a familiar face, Marcus, his head chef, holding a stack of newspapers. "Chef," Marcus said with a grin, "I think you need to see this." Chef Carter raised an eyebrow as Marcus handed him the papers. The headline on one of the front pages read, "Chef stands up to Trump, an unexpected victory of principle over power." He skimmed through the article, which detailed the events of the night, the confrontation with the president, his refusal to alter the menu, and the aftermath that followed. It was clear the media had a love-hate relationship with the situation. Some viewed Chef Carter's actions as heroic, others as reckless. But one thing was certain, people were talking. "What do you think?" Marcus asked, his tone half-joking but filled with a sense of pride. "I'm not in this for the headlines," Chef Carter replied, setting the papers down. "But I guess this is what happens when you do something that gets people's attention. They'll find a story in it one way or another." "I think it's a good story," Chef Marcus said. "It shows that there's still room for integrity even in the world of politics and power. People need that reminder." Chef Carter paused, considering his words. He had always prided himself on his integrity, his authenticity, but he hadn't expected that anyone outside the kitchen would take notice of it. To him, it had just been about sticking to his guns and doing what he felt was right for the meal and his team. "You know," Marcus continued, "this could really be something. People admire strength and they love a good underdog story. You've become that. An underdog who went up against the most powerful person in the country and walked away with his head held high." Chef Carter shook his head with a faint smile. "I didn't do it for the recognition, Marcus. I did it because I'm not going to compromise what I believe in. This meal was never about Trump. It was about serving something real, something that honors the craft of cooking. It was never going to be about playing politics." Marcus looked at him, a respectful nod in his direction. "I get it, Chef. But you did more than just cook that night. You showed the world that there's still room for integrity in places like this. In the kitchen, in politics, everywhere." Chef Carter considered this for a moment. It wasn't lost on him that the media attention was intense, but it didn't feel like it was all about him. It felt like it was about something greater. He had stood up for authenticity, something that, in today's world, was too often discarded in favor of power and expedience. The weeks that followed were a testament to the unexpected ripple effect of his actions. Restaurants across the country began to reference his defiance as a symbol of sticking to one's principles. Culinary schools held discussions about the importance of authenticity in the kitchen. Some even used his story as a teaching tool about standing up for integrity in the face of pressure. Chef Carter's story spread through social media, turning into something of a viral sensation. His refusal to change the menu became more than just an act of culinary resistance. It became a symbol of how far a person could go when they refused to compromise their values. Even the president, who had been angry at first, seemed to soften over time. There were reports of Trump mentioning Chef Carter's name in passing, acknowledging the chef's skill and determination. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a sign that the situation had taken on a different tone. It wasn't long before Chef Carter began receiving offers from prestigious food networks, chefs, and media outlets who wanted to interview him about his actions and what it meant to stand up to power. Yet, despite the attention, Chef Carter remained humble. He never sought the spotlight and continued to focus on the one thing that had brought him success all along: his passion for food. As the months went by, Chef Carter found himself at a crossroads. The pressure and spotlight that came with the media attention had started to weigh on him, but his love for the craft and his desire to teach others kept him grounded. He knew that his journey wasn't over, that there were still many meals to cook, many stories to tell, and many lessons to pass on. One afternoon, Chef Carter stood in the kitchen, looking out over the bustling city beyond the restaurant's windows. He had come a long way since that unforgettable night at the state dinner. His principles had been tested, but he had come out stronger, more confident in himself and his work. In the end, it wasn't just about the dinner. It wasn't about Trump, the controversy, or the press. It was about integrity. It was about staying true to yourself, even in the face of enormous pressure. And as Chef Carter looked around at his team, he realized that he had built something far more important than a meal. He had built a legacy of resilience, authenticity, and the courage to stand up for what you believe in. The kitchen hummed with the sound of knives chopping, pans sizzling, and laughter echoing from the back. Chef Carter smiled to himself. It had been a long road, but he had walked it with his head held high. And that, he knew, was a victory in itself.